away, Charlie.
Thank you. No, this is my first ever segment. It's a real pleasure. So I'm going to be talking about my essay in Islander issue 2, The Headless Tyrant. And basically this is an essay about the relationship between order and power in modern society. So there's a tradition in modern political philosophy that sees the sovereign's main role as being the guarantor of peace and social order within his realm. And this is best exemplified, I think, in the English social contract edition by Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, or the matter, form, and power of a commonwealth, ecclesiastical and civil, which Thomas Hobbes wrote and published in 1651. Now, as Hobbes put it, the agreement between sovereign and subjects brings to an end the war of all against all, the state of nature in which man exists by default, a place where life is nasty, brutish, and short, and any man can kill any other if he chooses to do so. So there's this tradition in political philosophy that sovereignty rests on a monopoly over violence. The state monopolizes violence and offers ordinary people peace and quiet and the ability to go about their daily lives without the threat of attack and murder, etc. So Max Weber, for example, in his famous definition of the state, in his lecture Politics as a Vocation from 1919, defines the state as a human community that successfully claims a monopoly of the legitimate use of political force within a given territory. So that's the classic sociological definition of what the state is. It is an organisation with a monopoly over force within a given territory. So I think broadly this is how we tend to think about the role of the state. We've been thinking about the role of the state for hundreds of years in these terms. We think that it's something that exists to ensure stability, but actually there's a much older tradition stretching right back to the ancient Greeks, to Aristotle, which sees the role of the sovereign, of the ruler, or of a particular kind of ruler, as actually being ensuring disorder. And really what the essay is about is it's about the fact that actually I think this is a much more apposite way to understand state power today, as a form of disorder, as a form of ordered disorder, I suppose, if you will. So in Book 5, Chapter 11 of Aristotle's Politics, which was written 2,300 years ago, I think he provides really the most accurate definition of what government and states are doing today across the West, really. He calls it tyranny. And I think we probably should too.
I just want to add that that's not... Aristotle wasn't in favour of this.
No, this is...
In Aristotle's well-run polis, the state inculcated virtue into the citizens, and so you didn't need a tyrant to control everything because the people themselves would be good. Of course, we live in the opposite of that now.
Exactly. So, I mean, what Aristotle is doing with the politics is a descriptive project, really. I mean, it's his lecture notes. That's how we generally...
Well, there is an argument that actually it's all normative, but I won't get into it.
They're definitely
fine details of it.
But so he's describing different kinds of government, basically, and one of the forms of government is tyranny. And he describes tyranny as the kind of counterpart of a properly constituted monarchy. So tyranny is that arbitrary power of an individual who is responsible to no one, governs all alike, whether equals or betters, with a view to its own advantage, not to that of its subjects, and therefore against their will. And Aristotle goes on to provide a long description of the kind of things that tyrants do in order to tyrannize their subjects, to rule over their subjects unjustly in order to maintain their own power. So he says, this is a fantastic description, so I'll read this one at length. So again, this is just a description, but it's actually framed in a kind of normative way where Aristotle says, look, if you're a tyrant, this is what you should be doing, because this is what good tyrants do. The tyrant should lop off those who are too high. He must put to death men of spirit. He must not allow common meals, clubs, education, and the like. He must be upon his guard against anything which is likely to inspire either courage or confidence among his subjects. He must prohibit schools or other meetings for discussion. And he must take every means to prevent people from knowing one another, for mutual acquaintance begets mutual confidence. So Aristotle describes a variety of different ways that tyrants maintain their power. They prevent free association, they surveil their subjects, they keep an extensive network of informers.
This is sounding very relevant.
I know,
Very relevant.
It is, the kicker's coming.
Yeah.
They sow quarrels among their citizens, they impoverish them with high taxes, they make wars to distract them. Aristotle also notes that tyrants prefer bad men and, like foreigners, better than citizens, for the one are enemies, but the others enter into no rivalry with him. So, I think we're starting to see perhaps some of the similarities with the modern situation, and you could easily be forgiven for thinking that Western governments have been reading Aristotle's Politics, and in particular this chapter.
Well, in particular Keir Starmer, because he was guilty of, within 2 months, he's guilty of doing every single thing there. It's actually kind of insane how he's speed running.
Yeah.
The persecution of every non-state school, the collection of a patronage network of donors that give him the sort of Khan and harem syndrome of the Soviet Union.
The preferencing of foreign peoples. The fact that he's currently trying to persuade Joe Biden to launch missiles at Moscow.
The divide and conquer strategy by calling anyone that is complaining against your mass importing of foreigners far right.
The new budget that's going to come out where your taxes are going up, I promise you.
The abolition of social circumstances where you can sit outside the pub and have a cigarette and a drink.
Exactly. Yeah. It's actually kind of crazy.
Yeah. So, I mean, this ancient conception of tyranny is obviously very relevant, and there's a chap called Sam Francis who gave the peculiar modern inflection of tyranny a new name, anarcho-tyranny. Now, he was writing in the 80s and 90s. He was cancelled for speaking at an American Renaissance conference, I think, in the 90s, and continued to write until his death in about 2004, I think, but he was generally held up as a white nationalist and a racist and all this sort of stuff. But he wrote very, very persuasively about the kinds of the little things that America's rulers did, and do, indeed, to make the lives of ordinary law-abiding citizens difficult and to allow criminals, basically, unlimited license to do as they would. And he called it anarcho-tyranny, as I say, but actually I'd quibble with calling it anarcho-tyranny. I don't think you need to add anarcho-tyranny to the name. I think it's all there already in the ancient definition of tyranny. I think it's just tyranny.
Maybe, but one could argue that a tyrannical society doesn't necessarily have to have an active criminal underclass.
No, that's...
So yeah. I do think anarcho-tyranny is a good distinguishing mechanism to suggest that... Sorry.
No, but that's what I was going to say, actually. That is one of the things I think that Aristotle doesn't really place emphasis on, is crime in particular. He describes so many recognisable things, as we've just noted.
He lives in quite homogenous states that are actually quite well governed by standards.
Yeah, exactly. But, I mean, anarcho... So here's Sam Francis describing some of the new techniques that are used to enforce anarcho-tyranny. Exorbitant taxation, bureaucratic regulation, the invasion of privacy, the engineering of social institutions such as the family and local schools, the imposition of thought control through sensitivity training and multiculturalist curricula, hate crime laws, gun control laws that punish or disarm otherwise law-abiding citizens but have no impact on violent criminals who get guns illegally, and a vast labyrinth of other measures. Now, probably the most spectacular instance of anarcho-tyranny, I think, in modern America of recent times is, of course, the summer of Floyd and the mostly peaceful protests of 2020. So we need to remember that these took place during the COVID-19 pandemic, at a time when people were confined to their homes, were told they couldn't go outside because they would be spreading a deadly virus, and yet we had the largest riots, the largest social protests in American history.
30 people died.
30 people died. 2 billion damage as a modest estimate. But really, I think the key to understanding these riots is that they actually benefited the regime. Now, I know Donald Trump was in power, but actually...
Well, the regime...
The regime
exists around.
Exactly. The regime isn't coextensive with the ruler, and certainly not when someone like Donald Trump is in power. But they served the American regime's purpose, which was to demonize Donald Trump during an election year. You have a racist president running for re-election
and just create an instability in his own governance.
Exactly. And they also, the other thing they did, of course, was they greased the skids on the largest wealth transfer in recent years. As this was Jim Cramer, totally mainstream commentator, saying for CNBC, this was one of the greatest wealth transfers in history. And it was, people were kept inside, small businesses were shuttered, not only because of the pandemic, but they were also burned to the ground. Who benefited? Well, Amazon and the big corporations and their CEOs, who became
also like big supermarkets, right? You were forced to go to Sainsbury's or Tesco's. You couldn't go to your local grocery store. Things like that.
Yeah, exactly. People forget just how crazy it was, and people don't join the dots, and I think they should. And this is a pattern that we saw repeated across the Western world. So, our very own Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, took the knee in 2020 with...
God, he's such an NPC.
Just awful, dreadful.
And he looks like the NPC meme right there.
He does. And we had black activist groups in paramilitary uniform marching through London.
Which is illegal, by the way.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to have, in Britain, you're not allowed activist groups with a uniform.
Since the 1930s that was banned, wasn't it?
Unsurprisingly.
So we're starting to get an idea then about what anarcho-tyranny is, this modern inflection of tyranny. But another way to look at it, actually, I think, to understand its hold on Western societies is to look at a country that actually punishes crime. And that,
I can't even imagine such a thing.
Imagine such a place. Yeah, well, such a place does exist. It's called El Salvador under its current president, Nayib Bukele. Maybe if we could just scroll through the pictures and show some of the good work that he's been doing. That's CCOT, the Center for, Terrorist Confinement Center, which was built to house tens of thousands of gang members. Bukele just said, look, enough is enough. We're going to declare a national emergency. We're going to arrest all the gang members. And the gang members handily had tattoos that allowed you to identify them. So anybody who has MS-13 tattooed on top of their head is likely to be a member of MS-13. And
so basically constructed Arkham Asylum.
Yeah, he has.
Just to be clear as well, I mean, El Salvador was having thousands of murders every year.
It was more dangerous than a war zone.
Yes, and to get into this gang, you had to rape or murder someone.
Yes, exactly. So El Salvador has gone from being the most dangerous country, or one of the most dangerous countries in the world, to the least dangerous country in the Western Hemisphere. Lower murder rate than the US. And that is the, love him or hate him, that's a miracle. And
necessary thing.
This is the interesting difference between tyranny and anarcho-tyranny, and I think it's interesting that you've rooted it in the reference to Thomas Hobbes at the start, because I think it's a very Enlightenment philosophy, and it's because there's a tacit admission by the ruling class that weaponize foreigners and criminals against the law-abiding population, that actually the blank slate anthropology isn't necessarily true. Like they're hoping that we all get to a post-crime multicultural utopia where we all hold hands. But you have to recognize there is a certain criminal clientele class, whether you bring it in or allow it to proliferate within the borders, that is distinct from the way that the majority of people live, and so you let them run free. Whereas Bukele, who doesn't have those priors baked in, is just like, oh yeah, I'll just lock up all the criminals. 1% of the population in prison? Yeah, cry harder as you get more tattoos but do no more murders, I guess. And miraculously, his civilization is short on liberalism but very good on peace and prosperity.
And of course, if you read something like, I don't like Steven Pinker, but if you read Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, then he talks about the fact that actually Western societies through the Middle Ages, every generation, I think, something like 1% of the male population was executed. It might even have been more than 1% of the male population was executed in order to keep the peace, essentially. And that's actually the reason why.
I actually read a couple of books on the death penalty because I found it fascinating. It wasn't that 1% would be executed. A lot of these would be commuted. The issue is actually war. When we are at war, murders go down significantly, and then when we're not at war, murders go up significantly, because of course that sort of, I guess, warlike percentage of the population are shipped overseas and possibly die over there. But it wasn't quite 1%.
Okay.
It was actually a lot of the
But
time.
it's still a substantial.
It's not as substantial as you would think, actually. I think it's more the sort of overall, like Thomas Hobbes, for him, the Leviathan's main function was overawing, being the overawing power over society, which would prevent many things from happening that otherwise would have happened. Seems to be the same with the death penalty. But I mean, obviously, it did also have the effect of taking out the congenitally violent laws.
Yeah, the ability of the state to wield deadly power against its citizens did have some effect, at least.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
So what's Bukele shown? Well, Bukele has shown that, contrary to what we're told in the West, crime isn't simply a fact of life. It's not like rain. It's not like the weather and inconvenience that nobody can really do anything about. It's just raining today. Somebody got murdered. Somebody got raped.
Crime is a choice.
Crime is a choice. Yeah, it's a choice. And the Western response to Bukele is very, very revealing indeed.
Oh, he's making them look bad.
He's making them look very bad indeed. And it's interesting to note, these human rights groups, newspapers, media groups, politicians who dare to talk about Bukele all emphasise, the human rights of the gang members being thrown into this enormous prison.
But never the human rights of their victims.
No, exactly, never. So it says, that in itself as well says something about the concerns of these groups in back home, with regard to their own sort of native populations. And it tells us, of course, as well that it's not just government that is upholding anarcho-tyranny in the West. It's also these institutions. It's also newspapers. It's the media complex. NGOs, etc. These are essential organisations for justifying and upholding anarcho-tyranny. So I think we've established that anarcho-tyranny exists. But it does, as I say, it has some unique inflections, I think, from the ancient examples that Aristotle gives, some different emphases. And in particular, I think those emphases today are crime and immigration. So Aristotle does talk about the fact, for instance, that the tyrant prefers foreigners. But he could never have conceived of a ruler who would actively go about replacing the entirety of his own population.
No. I mean, in Aristotle's conception, it was assumed that the tyrant would have a bodyguard of foreigners. The tyrant would specifically pay them to protect him from his own native population in order to keep him safe.
Yeah.
Like you say, he would never have thought that one of these tyrants would be like, well, we can just change the population.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. So there's obviously something different about anarcho-tyranny from ancient tyranny. So, I think if you look at the work of Samuel Francis, then he talks about immigration, but things weren't quite as bad in 1994 in the US as they are in 2024, and he died in 2005. So it needs some updating. But yes, if we want to see this central axis at work today, then we need to look no further than the Southport stabbings. And Axel Rudabukana, there he is, looking angelic.
Still hasn't been put on trial yet, has he?
No, that's strange, isn't it?
It's because it's a Crown Court trial rather than a magistrate's court, so that's why there's certain restrictions around the reporting. But
I don't really need to rehearse or re-rehearse the circumstances of the Southport stabbings. Needless to say, I think it is a very, very clear example of the way that, two-tier policing, for example.
Two-tier civilization.
It is weird, though, how we don't have an updated photo.
Yeah.
Just weird how they keep using the one of him.
Here's him at 11.
As a small child in primary school, as if the system, again, let him down. As if it's our fault for incurring on his human rights that he goes and murders 3 girls and stabs a bunch more.
But so we're getting to the kind of crux of what I say in this essay, which is that actually, who's in control? That's the question that I'm really asking. That's why the essay is called The Headless Tyrant, because tyranny in the ancient sense presupposes a tyrant, a person, right? A single person.
Individual.
Periander of Corinth. But anarcho-tyranny, at least in modern democracies, isn't the product of any single individual. I think that's clear, or even a single group. So Sam Francis himself, then he said that anarcho-tyranny is instead the product of the growth of the managerial state, bureaucracy, legalism. There's no plan as such. There are merely incentives within our power structures that drive government in the direction of tyrannizing its own citizens, including the kind of levelling and base numerical tendencies of democratic politics itself, where you end up seeing people as beans to be moved on a...
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, this is... I think this is in line, actually, with the more sophisticated thinking about the Renaud Camus, for example, contrary to what a lot of people say about him, then he's never said that the is a conspiracy. He's never said that it's a conspiracy by some particular group against others. What he's actually said is just that a particular mindset has come to dominate government in the West, institutions in the West, which he calls replacism. And that's basically just the belief that human beings are interchangeable. The native population of France is interchangeable.
It's the natural core view of liberalism.
Yeah.
So the more liberal we become, the more this becomes the doctrine.
Yeah, and so actually, really, is a product of the growth of democracy, industry, mass education, mass entertainment. It's not some group of shadowy figures sitting in a room conspiring to get rid of the native French. It's actually a much more complicated process than that. So, I mean, I think it's more important to understand modern tyranny as a kind of system that abides by, it fulfills a certain logic. It's not a procession of individual tyrants satisfying their personal whims.
And it would be so much easier to deal with if it was.
Exactly, and that is my fundamental point, I think, with this essay. And this helps us to grasp, I think, some unsettling truths, like, for instance, the ease with which the Conservative Party was able to pick up the mass immigration policies of the New Labour governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and just run with them. I mean, that should not have happened.
Well, the Cameronite wing won.
Yes.
Conservative Party.
Yeah. So, opposite parties replace each other and continue the same policies. And that's what we see in across the Western world, Even the people in charge are interchangeable and replaceable, but what matters is that they follow the incentives of the system and meet its needs. That's the fundamental thing that matters. So really what we're dealing with, I suppose, an example of the management heuristic. The purpose of a system is what it does. It's better to look at the way that the outcomes of a system rather than the people involved with it. So it's not about whether the Conservatives are in charge or the New Labour is in charge or even Reform are in charge.
The blob still exists.
Yes, it's a blob, and it has its own. The blob isn't a person. The blob isn't an organism, and yet it has its own intentions that are nevertheless separate and distinct from those of the people who are sort of caught up inside it in its guts. Which isn't to say that there aren't odious people at work in...
Oh, I imagine it's full of odious people, but it will be full of odious people the next time there's any kind of changing of the guard and whatnot.
So, we talked about the origins of the New Labour policy of mass immigration, the admission by Andrew Nether, for example, in 2009, that mass immigration policy was brought in by New Labour to rub the right's nose in diversity, to change the demographics of the nation. I mean, that was a deliberate policy, and the people who deliberately chose to do that are odious. They deserve our scorn, and they deserve to be held responsible. But nevertheless, people are waking up to the fact that government is at war with them now. It's clear people are.
We're running out of time, so we're going to have to end it there. But that is precisely the theme of the entire issue. We've clearly passed the limit. I mean, don't get me wrong. Charlie's essay is amazing, and you should definitely get Islander to read it in its full. But that exactly hits on the point, doesn't it? We've passed the threshold at this point. We're going into new, undiscovered territory, which again, aesthetically, just is perfectly represented by Rory. Superb. Go and get it. Honestly, it's really good. Hi folks, I hope you enjoyed that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters. If you did and you would like to support us, because of course we're demonetized on YouTube, go over to lotuseaters.com, sign up for £5 a month, and watch Survive the Jive and Bodade in discussion about the ancient Britons and the nitty-gritty details of the inhabitants of these islands whose DNA, if you were British, you doubtless still carry. Also, go over to X, formerly Twitter, and follow us at lotusseaters_com.